In the beginning, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat.
No, Odysseus, let him rack his brains with you and the other captives. How to fight
guilty.
Impossible. Trust me.
No one to weep for me, my friends. No wedding song.
Arma verumque cano, Troiae qui primus laboris Italiam
Dante ha fatto il pieno e per gli altri è rimasto ben poco, which means that Dante filled up.
I was the more deceived.
Confess that you were very bad to hurt my feelings.
Cried Candide, I'm through.
Enough. Who are you then?
Part of that force which would do evil evermore, and yet
She was eating a maraschino ice at that precise moment.
There is no
When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous dung beetle.
Good morning. Welcome to now class 17, if you can believe it. We are definitely on the downhill slope now, with about, 6 to go or 7 to go. Today we do Voltaire's Candide, the story which asks the musical question, can you be beaten, raped, robbed, have your butt sliced off, and live happily ever after? Absolutely extraordinary tale, isn't it? I'd like to get your reactions to the reading of it. Was it fun reading, or did you read it and go, wait a minute, what's going on here? People are dying and coming back and having body parts cut off.
Initially, when I started reading it, it was very easy and simple reading, and I thought, and this is a classic? What's going on? I could have written this.
Yes.
But then, as I slowed down and I took time to actually read the little witticisms and appreciate the little jabs that Voltaire took, I thought, oh wow, this is actually pretty deep.
Yeah, yes, yeah, good for you. That's a very good observation if you think about it, because certainly on the narrative level, which is the level you begin with, it really is a page turner, isn't it? What can possibly happen next to Candide? But you're right, usually by about the third chapter you've worked out the fact that there's an enormous gap here between the form and the content, that you're dealing with satire and you're dealing with an almost vicious kind of irony, and his targets are, I mean, we'd be here the entire hour ticking off his targets if we went through this work. So yeah, that's a good observation.
Well, it's so cleverly written, and his humor and wit are just phenomenal. And you know, it may sound naive, but I mean, to touch all the bases that he does in such a clever way. I mean, you know, in our century, we think we're so sophisticated and we know it all and everything, and he just compiles everything in one sentence. He's so concise and so witty.
Yeah, yeah. His style's very clear, isn't it? Yeah, I think that's what you mean by precise. Yeah, there's a clarity of the diction and of syntax, especially coming after Milton. It must have just been wonderful for you. After going through the torturous syntax of Milton. Let me do first here.
And you get a hint right away from Pangloss's name, Pan, which in Greek means all, and gloss. All is gloss. Yeah. So Candide, you know, it has such devotion to Pangloss. No matter what happens, everything is best everything is best in all possible worlds.
Yeah, yeah. Candide is that's one of his more attractive characteristics, isn't it? It's something that you and I don't share. That is, when we get kicked out of the garden, we probably do not so innocently go through life expecting only good things to happen to us, despite what actually occurs. Candide somehow just keeps plugging on, you know, and we'll want to know why. We'll want to try to figure that out. Let me go up and then down to Susan. Yeah.
Do you feel, I think I've got to ask other people, because I have this hint in my mind. This is something like the quest for the Holy Grail. This love. He gives up so much when other people would be content because he must pursue, and even when he gets this, he's so dedicated that he can devote himself to something that he no longer really wants. It was just like he's being driven toward an ideal all through it.
It is clear, it seems to me, that an ideal is driving him.
Yes.
He is reaching for something that may be beyond his grasp, and that may be an important element of the story, quite frankly.
Yeah.
None of you misses the irony, of course, of when he finally is reunited with Cunegonde. She is not exactly what he left behind.
Is shop-worn a kind way to put it?
Yeah, well, that would be very generous, yeah. Funny and generous, yeah. Yeah, we'll want to talk about what keeps him going. But love is certainly, and I mean that in the best sense of that term, love is definitely one of his motivations, it seems to me. Yeah, I think so.
And even when he gets to El Dorado, which is a kind of earthly paradise, really, he leaves it.
Oh, sure.
For her.
Yeah.
And it really is, it's sort of like a little peak that shows that you actually could do this. There are real people who live in El Dorado too, but they phased out all the kinds of imperfections and brutalities that we and he and people of his time seem to take for granted.
Yeah, you see El Dorado as a kind of positive ideal in the story?
Well,
not really.
We'll get some debate on this for sure.
Yeah, we will. But it certainly seems like a positive alternative to the kinds of brutality that he talks about.
Yeah, some kind of factionalism that you've seen.
And when they're talking about some of the brutalities, and they refer to these as the ordinary little ceremonies of war, and the admiral who is murdered because he wasn't quite brutal enough the last time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we'll be sure to talk about El Dorado as well, Barbara.
Yes. He leaves. Candide leaves El Dorado as Adam left paradise for their love. But El Dorado, I think, is more than the paradise in Paradise Lost. I think the people think a little more. They realize that they have everything and they give thanks to God. They don't pray for anything, but they give thanks. I think that they're more, they realize that they have, well, I don't know if they term it a paradise, but I think they know what they have and they're very thankful for it. And compared to the rest of the world, I mean, it is certainly a paradise.
Can I stir the pot here? Can I stir the pot? Can I stir the pot here a little bit and suggest that that's hell? That's about as good a description of hell as I've ever heard, where all your wants are satisfied.
Love isn't there.
You don't want anything. You've got everything.
It certainly is not a growth factor, is it?
Huh?
Complacency, which is what they were looking for, is not a growing process.
No. El Dorado, a positive or a negative? Yeah.
I felt it was a negative, because they really had no wants left. Even their riches they just let lie around, and
because they're not riches
to them. It's
from
not
their
riches
point of
to
view,
them, and it really isn't. But also it showed at the end and the conclusion where a little work and a purpose in life is what does make you happy.
But I'm not sure that wasn't found in El Dorado either.
Yeah.
And saying what Barbara's saying, they did know what they had.
Yeah.
They felt, wise and compassionate. We don't know that love wasn't there. It didn't enter into our protagonist.
Well, his was
Cunegonde
elsewhere. Wasn't there.
Right.
This reminded me of Homer, was Ulysses trying to get back. Penelope was very faithful. She rejected the suitors, where Cunegonde, was mistress to so many. And she was not as faithful as Penelope.
Yeah, that's part of the joke of Candide, is really just to do exactly what you did, is to see the connections, is to make the connections. And you've all done it. I mean, you talked about Adam and Eve, that's right away in that first chapter, or the second chapter actually, when he's booted out of the terrestrial paradise. I mean, that's a play on Genesis 3.
Yeah, I thought the irony was absolutely powerful. The philosophers could argue the grandeur of war, and the other side, the spiritual values were wrong, war is wrong, and yet to show the king singing the Te Deum as the battle subsisted, that among many other things. It just got points through in a way that just being rational never would.
Yes, good for you. I think you may be dancing right around what this story is all about, as a matter of fact.
He was pointing out the hypocrisy of the church.
Oh yeah, oh sure, oh yeah.
Hypocrisy of everything, but Voltaire, doesn't he say that to change the world, but to accept what you can't change?
Uh-huh.
And I mean, this brings me back to El Dorado again.
Accept is a tricky word. I gave you a quick but accept.
Well, change, I think he's saying to not to be complacent and not to take action. He certainly is for action and standing up for what you believe and freedom and so forth. But he's also saying not to over philosophize and overthink.
Yes.
To be content with what you have. Also, what you can't change, to be content with what you have.
Yes, yeah, I would agree with that. Let me ask. I want to get us on a different. I always ask you guys for questions. Do you have questions? Did I ask you that? I'm a little brain dead this morning, so be gentle with me. Yeah. Okay, Jeff.
Chapter 19. Martin, or the philosopher Martin, whatever.
Yeah.
He initially was accused of being a Socinian.
Oh yes, you don't have a footnote for that?
Later, no. I have my own little book version, and then he claims to be a Manichaean. What? Yeah, those are
Manichaean. Yeah, those are two what were known as heresies in the Catholic Church at the time. Actually, at the time, several hundred years before the writing of Candide. And just know that it's just factual or factional conflict within the church. They're heresies, and that's really all you need to. They're splitting theological hairs. That's the point. Yeah.
I wanted to know your interpretation of Milton, or your interpretation of Voltaire's interpretation of Milton, writing 10 books on the first book, the first 3 books of Genesis.
Voltaire was not a Milton fan. What can I tell you? It was a lapse in taste, and it happens. Homer nods too, as they used to say. A little too authoritarian for Voltaire. A little too rigidly dogmatic, I think, and probably a little too orthodox for Voltaire. Also, the blending of politics and religion, which was typical of Milton and Milton's age, would have been troublesome for Voltaire. Think of him as, you either blame him or praise him for the French Revolution. Voltaire, he gets it from both sides. The bourgeoisie exalts him, and the aristocracy, of course, condemns him for it. So yeah, he's not overly fond of
Voltaire has his catalog of enemies, as Dante did.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess
he sure does. Yeah, Voltaire was very much.
Suits then.
Yes, good point. Voltaire was a very active man, and very active in the courts of his day, and no surprise then that he would use this similarly as Dante used his as a vehicle for attack on those factions that were against him.
Seems like I read somewhere. Did he change or add to his name?
Oh, he's changed his name all the time.
Why did he do that? That's a question I have.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer you. I'm so far afield here, but he's famous for changing his name all the time. He would do signatures apparently and would change his name. He'd use his nephew's name and sign. Use his uncle's name and.
I wondered if it was a game or if it was.
I think of the devotee, which he adds to his name, I think is to give him a certain stature. Yeah. But that's a good question. I really don't know enough about the man. I'm gonna hesitate to answer that because I'll be.
His real name was not Voltaire, though.
That's correct. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Peter?
No, I was just continuing your other thought. He struck me. I couldn't find really anyone that he respected. He was a pure iconoclast. That seemed like any institution, any mainstream thought, he would criticize.
This is one of the arguments. This is one of the criticisms of Candide, and this is just the question I wanted to ask you guys to start with. He has been accused in this piece of a kind of wretched pessimism. That is, he's very happy to tear things down, but he has nothing to put up. What are the positives in this story? You can point to the negative attacks from now until the cows come home. You could do 30 right off the top of your head, I'm sure. But if I ask you, what does it stand for? Even the work at the end is a kind of negative thing. It's not for anything. It's to keep you from the evils of boredom, vice, and poverty.
And you don't think he's saying to thine own self be true?
Doesn't matter what I think. I have to ask the question. Yeah.
I don't think it's a negative book. At the end of the story, he says cultivate your garden. And I think in a way, I mean, yes, we each look to ourselves and make the most of yourself, your surroundings, the people that you touch. I don't think it's negative. I think that we're all mature enough to see that he does find the foibles in all of these institutions. But we know that certainly there are good in these institutions as well. I mean, I don't think we need Voltaire to tell us that. Mm-hmm. But maybe we do need him to point out and to satirize some of the things that we put on pedestals.
I'm still not clear what the positive, what is the affirmation in the story?
The last line, I would concur with that. The last line is a way of shaping, of creating what your own potential is. All these other gardens.
Well, this sounds awfully self-indulgent. I mean, am I playing classroom games here, you know? Well, it's rather self-indulgent. We're supposed to just turn our back on the world and say, the hell with the world, I'm going to take care of numero uno. I suddenly sound like I'm living in the 1980s.
But they've gone through the world.
Bestseller of 1980s, looking out for number one, right? The me decade. You know?
Your assessment of other places, other societies, other individuals is fine, but ultimately one must look inside and take care of that, you know, shape it according to one's own abilities, potentials.
Mm-hmm.
But they did go through other worlds and interact with other people, many people, and then settle into the garden. You know, you go through certain stages in your life, and then in the end, maybe you become a contemplative, and then absorb all these.
Yeah, so you stay out of the world, huh? Out of the marketplace of ideas. Ooh.
I don't think that's the
Boy, that sounds like craven cowardice to me. Comments, please. This is, you can see the game we're playing, but it really is it's a very important question, isn't it? What will be your relationship to the larger world? And if you indeed think that world needs changing, and boy, if ever a world needed changing, it was the world that Candide moved through. If that world needs changing, how are you going to do it? You know, so what is the proper relationship to the world beyond your garden becomes an interesting, very interesting question.
I think you need to learn something from your own experiences. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a positive that isn't stated as such.
And they have learned to withdraw from the world.
Well, the poor Candide, he just kept doing the same things over and over.
I know. What we're going to do here, let me warn you, we're going to look at those last three gardens. Chapter 30, you'll notice, the last chapter has 3 gardens right in a row. And they're worth looking at. We won't do it right away, but we'll do it soon. I went to University of Chicago and asked a fellow named Robert Morrissey, who teaches in the Department of Modern Languages or Romance Languages, his opinion of what this work was about, and let's see his reaction. Can you talk briefly about the genesis of this work, where it takes place in Voltaire's life?
The story of Candide is very much a kind of negative reflection of a story he did earlier, which was Zadig. He did it about, let me see, I think it was published in 1747, which has the same kind of epic journey and which tells the story of Zadig, who triumphs in the end thanks to friendship and love. And in the 10 years since then, well, many things have happened. When he was writing Zadig, he was very popular at the court. He had just been named the royal historiographer, and he was to be a member of the Académie Française. He felt his star was rising, and when he comes to Candide, it's a different situation. Personally, his life is private life is not going as well as he would like. He is in disfavor at the court. There has been in the interim a massive earthquake in Lisbon. And in general, we find that the dark side of the Enlightenment is beginning to surface now, that the philosophers are beginning to question fundamental aspects of the optimism that so pervaded the early Enlightenment. You find Rousseau rising during this period. Diderot has, as you know, a whole series of works that question as well. Even though he's the editor of the Encyclopédie, he has a whole series of questions that are very works that are very that really put into question all the fundamental assumptions of the Enlightenment. So this is part of a bigger questioning of the Enlightenment philosophy.
Yeah, indeed, it asks some big questions. Frederick the Great described Candide as, I believe, Job in modern dress. Is that the central question of Candide? Is it really about theodicy?
Well, yes, I think that's the fundamental question that he's asking. The function and the role of evil in the world, and I think he does this throughout this. He's trying to come to some sort of answer, I think, concerning what man can do in the world. What are the limits of our action, and what are the limits of our thought, in some sense? How much can we know about the universe? In Zadig, all of this was, we couldn't know much more, but Providence was basically taking care of things, yes, so that everything was for the best in the best of all worlds.
It was rather benign.
Right, exactly. Whereas here, of course, you have Pangloss, the great name that means to gloss everything, who is trying to interpret, I guess you'd say he's trying to interpret with the logic of words events that cannot be reduced to logic in any kind of sense. And
that's a point. That was a fun conversation I had with him at the University of Chicago. He, I hope he's not going to mind my saying this, but did you see he sometimes struggles? He thinks in French, I think. And did you see the struggle sometimes in pronunciations and things? It was a very provocative conversation. You notice his point about positing the conflict between thought and deed for Voltaire. That's very interesting. You're going to see this come up more and more and more and more. The need for deed, the need for action in the world, if we're to make some meaning out of this wonderful, wacky thing we call life. It's a very difficult issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very central issue in the book for Voltaire. To stop theorizing and philosophizing and act, and getting back to cultivating your garden, that certainly doesn't have to be a plot of land. It's what your desire is and what drives you. But to act.
Yes. The garden, I agree with you. The garden is not a literal garden. The garden is any kind of creative, productive work. That's clear on first reading, don't you think, that you understand that part?
But it was true in his life also. I mean,
yes,
according to this, he was very much a man of action.
Yes.
And didn't hesitate to back up his principles in unpopular support of people that he knew were unjustly being persecuted.
Yeah. How about this question? Yeah, I agree with you. How about this question of theodicy, which so many people have thought is central to this work? You heard me describe Frederick's estimation of it as Job in modern dress. The notion that there is a good and just God, yet there is terrible evil in the world visited indiscriminately against the good and the bad. What are we going to do with that? And clearly there's lots of evil in the world of Candide. There's physical evil. The Lisbon earthquake is probably the best example, or a storm at sea or whatever. Something quite beyond any person's control. Then there is the social evil, and you saw that at every turn. That takes its form in, let's use syphilis as a good example, right? There's something that goes way beyond, again, human control. And then there's the kind of personal evil of person against person. It's everywhere in this piece. When we look for the positive, we do struggle, don't we? It just seems to be evil upon evil upon evil. Flaubert described this work as the gnashing of teeth. It's a nice little metaphor for it, that it's just a kind of, ooh, you know?
Did you
him at the Thessalonians or
Did you say this was the beginning of the Enlightenment, where you thought that they thought at the time that man could answer all questions, the emergence of science, and I think he was disillusioned
Yes.
that, you know, science and man can't answer all those questions.
Good for you, yeah. I wouldn't say it's the beginning of the Enlightenment, however. I'd say quite the opposite, actually. I think it's on the downside. This is, I've used this expression so many times, you must be tired of it, but it is typical of the works we're reading this term. 1 foot in the old world and 1 foot about to step down into a new world yet to be born. And yes, you're right, that, that the relying on reason to answer the big questions, which was a mark of the Enlightenment, is starting to lose its grip. And indeed, if a work ever demonstrates to you that you cannot reason your way through the theodicy problem, it's this one. It suggests a whole different approach to the topic, and the approach seems to be through work.
One difference, too, seems to be with Job. I mean, that was one man's personal struggle with things that kept happening.
Yes.
And with Candide, the additional point that's made is it didn't seem to matter where he went,
Yes.
or what he did, or what he tried, and he went many places and experienced many different worlds and gardens.
Yeah, that's right.
And he found evil, incontrovertible, everywhere he went,
Yeah.
with the possible exception of El Dorado.
Yes. Yeah. 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 This is definitely the what is known in literature as the theme of the Homo Viator, man as wayfarer, man who wanders out. You'll see the movement in the piece is out away from Europe, and then back into Europe. Do you see that movement in the piece? And it's the trip back, I think, that's particularly interesting, especially when let's see, he goes to Paris, remember? And Paris is the pits, man. It's like, you know, it is just the worst. And then he tries Venice and meets the aristocrat. Remember Pococurante? The man who has everything, and he's bored by everything. Yes, I've read it, it's terrible, isn't it? You know, yes, I've tasted it, it's awful. You know, yes, I've heard the songs, they're terrible. It's just amazing, you know, how decadent they've become.
But Paris now, I'm sorry, what happened to him in Paris, I really am sorry about, because you just can't help thinking that if he would have just come in a different way, he would have had a much better experience.
I'm sure you're right.
Yeah. Well, getting back to what Professor Morrison was saying about nature, there are evils in nature that we can't do anything about, though maybe today we can do more with nature than we did then. But the institutions that man sets up, we can do something about.
Yes.
Yes.
And these are all man-made.
But they're too complex, huh? They become, Candide is hit by any number of man-made institutions during the course of this piece, whether they be organized religion, which is an institution, or whether it be a government. You with me on that? What's the problem? Has it become too complex? Has it lost its humanity? Boy, does that sound like a strikingly modern question to ask, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
These structures get very large and they take over, and they become other people's gardens. And the dictum at the end is cultivate our garden, which is all one can control. And it is an organization, but it's one's own organization and shape.
It's interesting in the last chapter. Obviously, the last chapter's key, right? I mean, it just, we must cultivate our garden just hits you with the force of a blow. And if you didn't get it the first time, he gives it to you again, emphatically at the end. You can't miss it. And you'll notice that I like to see the ending as opening outward. If you look at the three gardens, there's Kakambu's garden, which is miserable. No sense of purpose to the work at all. Then he visits the old Turk, It gets a little larger. This time it's a family unit, and they seem to be functioning quite well, although he certainly has a disdain. He definitely turns his back on the world in a kind of philosophic disdain. I know nothing about it, you know.
And Turk says that cultivating the garden with his 3 children keeps him from the 3 great evils: boredom, vice, and poverty.
And poverty, right? Yeah. Exactly, right. This is the point I made earlier about whether the garden actually does something positive, or whether it just keeps us from the negative. That may be a positive in itself. I don't know. It's an interesting gloss. But yes, this the old Turk's garden seems to be functioning quite well. He definitely has a kind of deistic view of the world. When asked about suffering and things like that, his response about does the captain worry about the rats on the ship that's a beautiful expression of deism, you know, where the guy makes the ship, or the captain is running the ship. He's not concerned about the rats down there. And the notion of deism, of course, is the world created and God withdraws from it and pays little or no attention to it. And then let me just continue the idea. And then the last garden is obviously more than a garden, because look at the roles people are playing, right? Kunigunda becomes a pastry chef, doesn't she? Or, you know, of some considerable note. Yeah. So, so here we have an even larger scale. We've gone from the individual to the family to now a kind of commune, was what we would call it, of course. And of course, what's interesting and kind of cheap about about the ending is that this work just organizes itself. You guys notice that? But everybody just happens to have a different skill. How convenient, you know? And who's in charge? Well, we're kind of all in charge, you know? You hear where I'm going with this? And then we confront the nasty realities sooner or later of what happens when 3 people want to be the pastry chef, you know, and what happens when little hierarchical uglinesses raise their head. You with me? It's a nice vision at the end, but one wonders about its fragility, and that's what I think is the real strength of Voltaire's conclusion. I always think of the conclusion of Candide as somebody. All good conclusions should do this, I think. Even essay conclusions. You're driving along at 40 miles an hour, you hit the brakes. Okay? That's what a conclusion should do. What happens to the passengers in the car when you hit the brakes at 40 miles an hour? They all move forward. You know? And it just drives me crazy that students are taught to do just the opposite. They're taught to come to the conclusion at 40 miles an hour and throw it in reverse and go back up into their essay to conclude, when you should be doing just the opposite. You should be pointing it out. You should be suggestive. You all with me on this? I think Voltaire does that gorgeously in this piece, because you finish it and you're left with that garden, and you start thinking about that garden and the world that he had created in this piece, and you realize its fragility. It really is like an eggshell, isn't it? Any number of forces. Don't get trapped into thinking all physical evil just ended just because Voltaire didn't write about it in chapter 3. He spent 29 chapters telling you all about that. And social evil did not end, even though it's not mentioned in chapter 30. He spent 29 chapters writing about that. You get me? So that garden at the end is really fragile. It's really special. And he seems to be suggesting to us it's our best hope.
But in that hierarchical arrangement, you would want somebody more like Virgil at the head and not Pangloss. Somebody who's more aware of the world and, you know, operates by reason and not just glossing over life as he does.
I don't think Pangloss is in charge. If we ask who's in charge, it's kind of everybody and nobody, huh? Kind of falls between the cracks. And also, please understand, in the end, Martin and Pangloss are there. They have their place. And we are told that they occasionally would slip back into windy theorizing. But Pangloss, Martin, and Candide in the middle, the meliorist, You know, you have one who says the best of all possible worlds. You got the others, it's the worst of all possible worlds. And there's Candide right in the middle, the meliorist. They all have their place. So if I ask you, what is Candide doing in the garden? You can't tell me, can you? What's his job?
Mediator.
You can tell me about all the others, but you can't tell me about those three that I just mentioned. They seem to be the intellects of the garden, and there does seem to be a place for it, but it's a secondary place, to be sure. It's a fascinating work, isn't it? This work really holds us in the 20th century, it seems to me, because it seems to come so close to life as we know it. All of these, you could write your list of targets here of all those forces way beyond your control, which make your life kind of miserable sometimes. You know? And the question for us is, if this world is crazy, and that's the modern view, you know, the world is nuts. You know, it doesn't run like a clock. It runs like where am I going to go with this? It runs like you know, like atoms going all over the place. You know, there's no logic to it. There's no rhyme to it. There's no reason to it. If that's the case, and if there's all this evil in the world, if we could walk out of here in 15 minutes and get hit by a car, or have a building fall on us, or an earthquake, or whatever it takes, then how the hell am I supposed to live? What am I supposed to do here? How do I go on in such a crazy world?
You make today count. You don't put it all off to the future.
Well, yeah. That sounds real easy, doesn't it? You ever try that?
Very often.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it's very hard. Yeah. Hey.
There's an adage that says that suggests that man should live each day as if it's his last and plan as if he would live forever.
Yeah. You're both giving me traditional views, you know, which is, you know, there's the old Zen notion of living always in the moment and being aware of the moment, which is extremely difficult to do, just very, very difficult to do. It takes heightened senses to do that, and it means trusting senses. Then there's, of course, the existential view of the notion of living each day as if with an awareness of your impending death, so that you will live fully and authentically through your life.
It's also the constant struggle that man has to go through. I mean, he always has adversities, and he's always struggling up the hill with the stone, kind of thing. But something else that was very interesting at the very end of the book, I thought, was the Turkish dervish.
Yes.
And they kept asking him, you know, these different questions.
That's the second garden in chapter 30. That's the old Turk. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
He said God makes the world and then abandons it. I mean, the rest is up to us.
Right.
And that's. I mean, I don't see as Voltaire being anti-religious either. Martin said something about I am and he named a certain name for him, a proper noun, which I don't remember. But to me, that was like agnosticism. That there was a God, but he didn't help. I mean, he put us out here, and the rest is up to us.
Yeah, that's the deist position. That's what I was talking about earlier, about the captain and the rats on the ship.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, before the Age of Enlightenment, when the theology was saying to man, God created an ordered universe. Now it's up to you with your free will. Try to maintain order on earth. So you had that order before you. It was God made, so there was something to aspire to.
Precisely, this is a Miltonic view that you're describing, Yep. And now that seems to be gone.
Yeah.
Yes, that kind of neatly ordered universe seems to be gone. If I ask you about providence in Candide, you just kind of smile, don't you? Divine providence in Candide? No way, right? No way. This God has disappeared. He's gone. He's done his job, as you're suggesting. Now it's yours. Yeah.
Nobody talks to him. How do you know?
Oh, well, yeah. Okay.
From what Valeria was saying, Voltaire opens, and I think that we find them in a situation which is so complex and of their own doing, the 72 quarterlings, so she couldn't be married to someone who only had 71.
Yes.
And that was that many generations behind her. And how because the mother was the fattest, she was looked up to. And all the things which in their little sphere which they had created, they had control. I mean, talk about complicated. It couldn't get more than that as he proceeded through life. And the anticipation that all life was like that, the acceptance that life was going to be an inability to surmount. There were so many things that were set you could never overcome. I mean, how can you get more generations behind you? You can't. But you could still aspire knowing you'll never achieve. I mean, he set us up from the very beginning to this struggle against what we were offered in life.
Yeah, that's a good point. You'll notice that obviously one of the things that keeps Candide going is hope and love. Keep him going. If I say to you, this is just a terribly pessimistic work, which is the way so many people have responded to it, you do see, don't you, a kind of redemptive quality to hope and love in this piece. And if we must cultivate our garden, why? In hopes of what? Can you answer me that? In hopes of what? What do we get from cultivating our garden?
Happiness, a good, rich life.
Happiness, but
caring
see, now I was thanks. because happiness might be the devil's invention.
Fell into that one.
You know, yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah, sure. Happiness. Oh, I'll be happy. I've got to be happy. I'll go to El Dorado. Who couldn't be happy in El Dorado? Well, guess what?
Someone in love.
Yeah, they couldn't. They couldn't be happy in El Dorado, where everything is satisfied, where you just don't seem to need anything. Happiness. Ooh, that's the one that drives us, right? Happiness, happiness, happiness. Got to be happy, right? It's your right to be happy. It's in. Yes, right. Thanks. You knew where I was going with that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we write it into our Constitution. You know? It's in our inalienable right to pursue it. You know, happiness is the driving force. Happiness. Read this piece. Happiness what an insane concept. You know, life can make nonsense of your happiness at any moment. You know, is the happiness in the pursuit rather than in the achieving, you know?
Candide did learn the pursuit of the goal. Excuse me.
He learned?
No, the people were complacent. They didn't need, this was not happiness. This was a state of mind.
Yes, and they were afraid that they were going to be like everyone else if they stayed there. Very interesting observation. Right. They did not want to be like everyone else.
He's an overachiever.
Yeah.
No, I really didn't see that. I thought that he left not because of rejection of anything they stood for. In fact, that was tempting, the way I was reading it, but because he had to have Cunegonde.
Oh yeah, it's not an either or. I don't think it's an either or.
No, but it's not like they were there without intellect or a state of ennui or anything else. I would like to have known more about what was going on in El Dorado.
Oh, sure.
The main contrast I saw was the lack of brutality and inhumanity to your fellow. That wasn't there, and that was the starkest contrast to me to what he was encountering everywhere else. Now that to me is desirable. I don't think we have to have brutality as an element. That seems to be something that's worth winnowing out. Now what you have left, I don't know for sure, but
you made a legitimate and good point, I thought, earlier in the hour when you talked about that as a kind of omega point, when you talked about that El Dorado dream as a motivator for the Last Garden. I completely agree with you on that. Yeah, that it is a model society. There's no question about it. But it's so unreal. See, that's one of the things that Voltaire gives it to you and takes it away, because he holds this up to you, and then he gives you enough detail for you to realize, well, boy, this is dreamland, you know? Where Pococurante, you can say, yeah, that guy's real, and Paris is real, you know? When you see El Dorado, you know it's not real. And I think that's the point. See, I think that's the point. It is that ideal that he holds up as a positive.
Or that you have to be there voluntarily. And everything he needed was not there, and he returned to a more violent atmosphere because his love object, his goal, his ideal was in that more violent world.
Right, okay, yes, right, right, yep.
The greatest sense I get from El Dorado is not so much that it's unreal. There's a reality to it in the sense of possibility.
Yes.
That actually we could organize ourselves this way.
Yes.
But we're not.
Right.
And the sense I have from El Dorado is its isolation from the world where his love is, and that the return is to the world. And if you're gonna find El Dorado, you have to do it in a way that is connected with the world, in a way that El Dorado is not.
He's not.
With the rest
Yeah,
of it.
I agree. That's why I was saying earlier, he both gives it to you and does not give it to you at the same time. It's also curious too that he places El Dorado right at the center. The little chart of gardens I gave you of the 12 gardens, you'll notice that it's right at the center, also suggesting, I think, its primacy of place.
As Eric mentions possibility, I'd love to hear your comment on all the resurrections or the rebirths or the Lazarus that we have. I was sure we would never see Pangloss. I got to
You were even hoping for it, I bet.
Well, this is one guy that's not coming back, and I was mistaken.
That's really part of the satiric form of the piece. He's having lots of fun with about 10 different genres simultaneously, but one of the genres he's having a lot of fun with is travel literature. The travel literature of the time, if you've ever read any, have you read some? I see you nodding. Yeah, it's just hysterical. If you read some of the travel literature from the earlier part of the 17th century, latter part of the 16th century, right on up into the 18th century, you wouldn't believe what was in America, for example. You just would not believe what were on the shores of Virginia. Monsters like right out of Jurassic Park. I mean, it was just extraordinary. They tell these just roaring tales, and one of the things he's playing with are all these terrible plot improbabilities that were so much a part of this picaresque kind of literature. The picaro, the hero who goes out into the world and confronts these strange worlds and then comes back to tell about it. So I think it's partly that. The dismembering and things like that, though, I think is a little bit more interesting, in that I think he's suggesting quite literally how the individual is diminished by the world, how you really are cut up to shreds, you know, how you do have limbs lopped off you. You are made smaller, you are disfigured by this world, and I think that point's quite serious. But the other, I think, the plot improbabilities are all with an eye to the kind of satire he's writing on forms, on these romantic, picaresque forms.
I think he's also satirizing love, because in the whole piece, Candide is in search of Cunegonde. Mm-hmm. And he goes through and he gives up all these things for her, and he goes through all these terrible tribulations, and at the end, when he gets her, in his heart of hearts, he really doesn't want her.
That's right.
But he feels committed, that he is an honest, truthful man. But I think Voltaire is saying too that be careful what you love, because you may get it. And it may not be what you want or what you thought.
Yeah, maybe. I think somebody said earlier, described Cunegonde as a love object, and I think that was very well put. That's indeed what she was. She was an object. For whom the quite romantic Candide is prepared to abstract into a kind of ideal figure. So what does it mean to cultivate our garden? Let's stop beating around the bush here. What the hell does that mean? We must cultivate our garden.
Could it be the reality, except that our garden has to do with the fact that since we cannot escape evil, that we can't run from it, and because even when we would do good, we often don't or can't, the best we can do is just to be the best we are, the best that we can be, the best we know how, given our circumstances.
Okay, now how do we do that? That sounds great. You know what I'm doing with you? That sounds terrific. But so I want to go out now and do that. I want to do just what you tell me to do.
Each man works his own salvation. I think ultimately, I mean, there's some of us who believe in God and all the good that He is, and some of us have other gods. Each man works out his own salvation. And hopefully that God is strong enough and sufficient for the day, for the person.
Okay. Somebody else on the garden? Yeah.
Don't over-theorize and don't overthink. Do. Just do.
Ooh, Hamlet in reverse, huh? Yeah. Give us action, huh?
Well, or marry thought and action.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's not as if he's saying don't think, to be sure.
Feelings,
Yeah, right.
His feelings entered in there, and they need to. I mean, that's part of humankind.
Does the work have to be practical?
To you.
Is that implied in we must cultivate our garden? That is, it must issue in something?
Partially.
Mustn't there be a harvest? You know, mustn't there be a product?
I think so. I think each one of us has a circle of influence, and our ability to influence for right or wrong, good or bad, indifferent, is pervasive. And to that extent, it has to be practical. We're not cultivating gardens for just ourselves.
Yeah. So you're not gonna change the world, but you might change yourself.
Well, you can influence the world.
You might change the world. And here I'll hark back to a personal favorite of mine, Thomas Merton, who ended up a contemplative,
Yes, I know.
but through whose writings and the very little traveling that he did do may yet help us to change the world. New seeds of contemplation.
But his writings are his harvest. I mean, you know, to play with the garden metaphor, right? I mean, without those writings, he does not touch you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So if you're going to have the broader...
So that's his action in the world.
That's exactly.
Okay. Yeah, just so long as we're on the same wavelength.
Yes.
Yeah. So even a contemplative, even a Trappist monk, can be active in the world if he does something that issues in a harvest. It's not enough simply to be contemplative. Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. Good.
I don't know if...
Sorry. You guys are always difficult for me.
All right. Well, I don't know if it's really necessary to have the garden produce something, because I keep on thinking about what the old woman said at the very end when she posed the question, well, is it better to go through everything that we've gone through, even though it was very hard for us, the trials and tribulations we went through, or is it better to sit here and do nothing and work our garden? And when they talked about the garden at the very end, they didn't really emphasize what the garden produced.
That's correct.
As much as they emphasized their roles in the garden.
You're right.
And
but let me stop you just for a minute to say the old Turk's garden was, if you see the succession of gardens, you see that the product is important, because the old Turk talks about taking his product and marketing it in the world. So don't isolate simply the last garden. See the opening out. You know, if you're working a garden, if you're cultivating a garden, it's got to issue in something.
Okay.
And what are you going to do with
I'm
it?
Excluding that, but I'm just saying it seems that it's also just as important as what the product may be. It's important to do the work in the garden.
Yes, indeed. Yes, good for you. Yes. Okay, I misunderstood you. I'm sorry. Yeah, good for you. Right. He wants a kind of another way of saying what you're saying is that rather than scientific speculation, he wants applied science.
Yes.
You know what I mean? He wants the applied science. He wants the science in the world rather than the science in the laboratory. Something that's going to issue in something. Did you? Yeah. Let me go to Eric first. Yeah.
Going back to the Thomas Merton story and the idea of the Trappist monks, that there may be other Trappist monks who, because of their community with Merton, you know, like their work enters into his writings, so that just maintaining that community, you know, like acting in keeping this garden as a place of peace and community, and a place where you weed out some of the evils.
Yeah, see, that's beautifully done, because that's just that's exactly the movement, isn't it, in chapter 30, where it goes from the individual to the family to the community in the best sense of that term. That's a good word to use for the final garden. It is a communal garden.
And then pure science, science that's not applied or something, could also be pursued if it's in community with people that are actually out in the world.
That's our Martin and Pangloss in Chapter 30. Remember, they do have a role. They are in Chapter 30. There are pure scientists, if you will. There are thinkers. Yeah, good point.
Well, and I think it does behoove us to keep in mind what our products are, what our harvests are, even looking at our national garden right now. I'm beginning to believe that our main export isn't any of the things that we like to think of about as individuals, like cars and shoes and that, but arms.
And cigarettes.
Yes, right. Because they're not having such good luck selling them here, they'll make them for abroad. We need, I think, to think about that. You know, they sold us the arms under the name of defense, and we had to take care of ourselves. And really, as the economy is suffering, it's becoming more and more apparent that we were selling them. That's maybe our chief export.
And you've been hearing for decades now the notion that you're not, if you want to change the United States, you've got to do it locally, right?
Yes.
Think globally, act locally. Isn't that the phrase? Something like that. Think globally, act locally.
I think it is being splendid like a blade of grass, walking tall in your own life, keeping your eyes about and being alert about what's happening around you. And if most people do that, then our nation and ourselves are going to be in much better position.
Yeah, it is a work, I think, that you very easily find modern applications for. Would you agree with me? Now, what's particularly poignant about it, and would that we had more time, is what's happened to the quality of our work. In the garden, there is so much more intimate a connection between one's labor and the product of one's labor. For most of us who work in enormously complex systems, the work is alienating, as so much in modern life is alienating. The work, in short, becomes not an end in itself, as it ought to be, but it becomes a means for producing capital, right? It's a means for making money. And how many people do you know who are utterly miserable but are making money? You know, I mean, you do. I mean, this is our trap, isn't it? The nature of work. You're going to see this become increasingly an issue now in world literature. From about the Industrial Revolution, from about the 18th century on up into the 20th century, until it becomes, for us, for our purposes in this class, when we read one of the defining works of the 20th century, man is reduced to a cockroach. Yes. Gregor Samsa is reduced to, actually it's a dung beetle, but we think of him as a cockroach.
Or a machine in this age.
Yeah. The work becomes so alienating, so dehumanizing, that he becomes an insect. And we identify with Gregor in ways that quite surprise us. So Voltaire's vision is a very optimistic one, it seems to me, not a pessimistic one at all. That what allows us to go on in this meaningless, crazy world, so full of evil, is our ability to fashion meaning out of our action in the world, out of our work. And the work becomes the salvation. The doing becomes the salvation, not the empty theorizing, not the spinning of verbal webs. The whole point of this one seems to be that words ain't gonna cut to it. You gotta have deeds, you gotta have action, you gotta get out in the world. And you're now starting to ask questions and we're almost out of time. It's gotta be real fast.
The subtitle of the story is Optimism.
Optimism, yeah. Yeah, good for you, yes.
Satire,
Yes.
but you know, at the end it really isn't.
Yep.
And given all the evil in the world, maybe this is the best of all possible worlds.
On that happy note, we're going to end. On that optimistic note, we're going to end. Thanks very much. That was good. Good.